Welcome everyone to day 2 of Decolonizing Economics 2024 Earth Day to May Day. We are so pleased to have everyone here joining us today, and we are so excited for the 5 sessions that will be happening throughout the day for day 2. Just to give you all a little bit of background, if you haven't been a part of day 1 already and had a chance to take a look at some of the sessions and the offerings that we've been able to share thus far, we will be recording all of these sessions so that they're available for you after the summit. We also have an opportunity to stream many of these sessions using Free Speech TV as one of our partners after the summit as well. So we'll have a little bit of time in between when the session concludes and when you're having access to those videos. But if you missed anything, don't worry about it. It will be available for you after the summit. A couple of things I also want to share is that we have a couple of interactive components that we're using this year for the summit, including a Padlet. So if you have some emerging questions or some thoughts that are coming up for you during day 2, we have a separate Padlet resource that you can play with, capture some of the things that have been really kind of like those juicy things that are coming up during the sessions that you want to share or expand on. So use that resource. It was really vibrant and fun seeing what everyone was contributing yesterday. So that's available for you to use. We also have a Zoom social space that opens between 12 or will be open between 12 and 5. And so if you want an opportunity to kind of debrief or decompress in between sessions, network, chat with folks, you'll see that at the end of your Zoom links for day 2. So that's open between 12 and 5, and we encourage you to pop in there and see who's hanging out and talk with folks like you would be able to if we were all convening in person. But the last thing that I'll say is that it's such a privilege, responsibility, a challenge, a commitment to do this kind of work. And as the summit coordinator, I'm so grateful to see so many people joining us from all over the country and even the world to be a part of this conference. This is the 5th iteration of the Post-Capitalism Conference, and our focus on decolonizing economics is an explicit challenge to ourselves and participants to center Indigenous wisdom, perspective, and knowledges. Decolonization is not a metaphor. It is a path towards just social, political, and economic institutions. And a call to decolonize economics acknowledges that in order to build the movement for reparative justice, we need to first understand the extent to which colonialism has influenced and continues to influence our modern economy. And so on that note, I'd love to pass it to our esteemed panelists, our presenters here today, who will be sharing more on the topic of democratizing the economy. So thank you all so much for joining us, and I'll pass it to Emily Kawano of the U.S. Solidarity Economy Network.
Thank you, Nicola. Yeah, so I am very honored to be here and with a great panel. So yes, I'm Emily Kawano. I'm one of the founders and co-coordinator of the U.S. Solidarity Economy Network. And my day job is I'm the co-director of Wellspring Cooperative, which is a nonprofit based in Springfield, Massachusetts, building a network of worker-owned businesses as well as solidarity economy initiatives. So this panel is going to be really exciting. We have 3 speakers. We're going to be going in the following order. We have Neil McInroy, who is the global lead for community wealth building from the Democracy Collaborative. We have Trinity Tran, co-founder and lead organizer for the California Public Banking Alliance, and Lydia Lopez, the co-director for organizing and partnerships from the California CLT, Community Land Trust Network. And before we just start with Neil, each speaker is going to have around about 20 minutes. And we'll hold questions and answers till the end. So please put your questions, comments, thoughts in the chat. And David Cobb will be monitoring that. And just a couple other things to note. Neil has to leave at 1:15, so we'll be front loading questions for Neil in that first 10-minute block. And then the other thing I want to say is just a little bit of framing, a couple things for presenters to address. One is the title of this workshop is Democratizing the Economy. And that is a really important dimension, but it's not enough, right? Like you could have the democratization that ignores environmental issues. You could have democratization that is also not that might be racist or whatever. So like how to think in a more expansive way than just democracy. That's one important dimension. But there are others that are important to integrate. So that's one. And then the other is there's so much great work going on. There is so much like amazing on the ground concrete work going on, and you'll hear about that today. But how do we, in this particular moment of all these convergent crises and the failures of our current economic system, how do we grow in terms of scale? So that's growing all these instances, all these practices in size, but also growing in terms of connection. So something for presenters to kind of work in, hopefully. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Neil as our first presenter.
Thanks, Emily. And I think I've got some slides to share, which hopefully Jack will put up. Yeah, great introduction. And hey, what an important conference this is in terms of decolonize economics, because surely we do need to decolonize our economy because it's colonized by plutocrats, wealth, and power. So it's a great event, and I'm really privileged to be part of it. As Emily said, I'm the global lead for community wealth building. I've had a career where I toggle between, if you like, activism and kind of policy, if you like, the kind of grassroots, organic activism, and how, but also mainstream policy as well. So I toggle between the two, and I suppose I'm also, it's worth saying, I'm a bit old enough to be original punk rocker. I'm a punk. I'm an anarchic in some way. I want to rip things up and start again. But I'm also a bit of a hippie. You know, I think we need to commune more. So there's a dialectic going on in me. Maybe you'll see it as I go through this presentation. So next slide, please, Jack. Just a little bit about the Democracy Collaborative. We're a think, do, change organisation building a people-powered vision for a new democratic economy. And we work with activists, but also the policy community as well. And community wealth building, which we'll talk a little bit about, is a kind of key plank of our work. Next one, please, Jack. Just situating this in the moment we're in. You know, we're in a moment of deep crises, climate and ecological crisis, growing inequality, racial and social injustice, crisis of democracy. The magnitude of what needs to happen is daunting. The social contract, if there was one, is pretty much broken. So it's a system problem, unprecedented in the history of humankind, you could argue, in terms of this moment we're in. It's a system problem, and any system problem needs systemic solutions. This is not just a little bit here and there. This has to be a system change, really. Next one, please, Jack. So it's kind of like we've got to wake up. I mean, all of us on this call have woken up and smelled the coffee, whoa, paradigm shift. You know, we're moving from an old world to a new one. We all need to be awake to this moment. And increasingly, more and more people are. But some people aren't. Some people are dozy, sleepy, reluctant. But we need to wake up and see this huge, unprecedented challenge we're in, and how we have a system problem and need system solutions. Next one, please, Jack. And it reminds us of the Italian communist writer Antonio Gramsci. The moment he was talking about the 1930s, but you could see it of like these times like that. The old is dying, yeah. The old way, the old order is creaking, but the new is not yet born. It's not there yet. And when all of us feel so uncertain and so, worried and fearful, and we can't get anything done, and it seems all complicated, it's because we're in an interregnum. Yeah, the old is dying, the new's not yet born. We're kind of in that horrible space. And in that horrible space, a whole range of morbid, horrible things happen. And you can see the reactionary stuff that happens across the country at the moment. These morbid symptoms appear in the cracks before we've got this new thing being born. Next one, please, Jack. So you could see it as an inflection point, a paradigm shift point. The old is dying, the new's not yet born moment. But importantly, wealth and power, obviously, they've got a lot to lose, so they don't want to change. Or even worse than that, they're nihilistic. They actually think it's too late to change. We're all kind of doomed in terms of the ecological crisis. We can't fix it. Yeah. So we're just going to hunker down. Yeah. Buy bunkers as they are in increasing numbers. So we're at this inflection point, and the new journey is a struggle, folks. We all know it, don't we, in our work? We're all struggling, transitioning from a now unsustainable, long-standing, fossil-fueled economic growth model to something that's new, green, and more universally generous. The old way of doing things not good enough, but the new's not fully there yet. So I'm just situating what do we need to think about and do. Next one, Jack. Now, what's helpful, of course, is we have the solidarity economy, decolonize economy, a whole family of movements. Now, sometimes some of you think, oh, well, what community wealth building or well-being economy, and we've all got our, likes and dislikes. So, but we're all part of a family of movements trying to play in this paradigm shift moment, trying to work through this inflection point, trying to build anew. And I think we need to generally extend hands of comfort and generosity with everyone that's in this sort of space, because nobody's got one answer. Yeah, it's all together. We need to work together much more effectively. So there is a family of movements, and I think we need to work like a family. And conferences like this are so important to this family notion, and we're working together. There's differences, but I think our commonalities are much greater than our differences. Next one, please, Jack. I should say I'm jet lagged, so I'll keep drinking water. So apologies. Well, fundamentally, we've got a problem with wealth. Community wealth building is driven by this problem of wealth. 5 of the richest men have more than doubled their wealth since 2020. While 5 billion people have made poorer. I think it's about 20 of the richest people own the same wealth as half the population of the world. This is unprecedented concentrations of wealth. Even in the time of kings in Europe, and even then there wasn't the concentration of wealth we have now. And we valorize. We say, "Whoa, wealth, that's the way to go." If a monkey hoarded more bananas that could eat, well, most of the other monkeys starved. Scientists would say, "What the hell's wrong with it?" Yeah, when humans do, we put it on the front page of Forbes. Wealth is a problem, and the patterns of wealth are a key issue for us, and we need to address that fundamentally. And for community wealth building, it's the key thing we address. Next one, Jack. And we need to think about flows of wealth. Wealth is a defining feature of all economies. Who has it? Where does it go? How do people get their hands on it? And how does it nurture the planet? So patterns and flows of wealth are fundamentally important. And that is another key aspect of community wealth building, to think about the flows of money and where the reservoirs are, the lakes. How do we capture it? If we think about wealth flows, money flows, like a hydrological system, a water system, how do we make sure that flow actually genuinely nurtures places, people, and planet, opposed to landing, disappearing into a big estuary and out into the ether of the global seas, the global economy? We need to create an intricate hydrology of wealth capture and wealth circulation. Next one, Jack. And of course, wealth is extracted at a rate of knots from our places. We are very abundant amount of rich, but it lands in a place, and the people that own the assets, the people that own the means of production, they extract the wealth. And you see reactions like this. I took this one, was in Greece. Airbnb tourists, F off, refugees welcome. It's saying, the tourist dollar is extracting the wealth, and it's messing up the local culture, the local identity, the local milieu, if you like. Next one, please. Yeah. This very complicated diagram here is basically saying a very simple thing. Of all wealth in the USA, less and less is coming back to us in the form of wages. It tells us that if you own assets, that's how you get wealth. You can see the high point there of labor unions, industrial struggles, economic struggles. There was a high point in terms of total wealth coming back through wages. That is declining, and we can fight our battles in terms of unions and fight our battles in terms of good wages, but ultimately the battle is about assets. We need to own more of our assets. Otherwise, this wealth gap will just increase. The problem of wealth extraction will continue. We need to own more, folks. That's basically what that diagram's saying. Next one. And one thing about owning is we need to think much more about democratizing the economy. That rather jokey thing at the top there. A charitable act is giving a family a fish if they're poor. Sustainability is teach a family to fish. But real social change is where you actually create this collective working together, owning both lots of fishing rods, but working together collaboratively in that. And that bottom diagram is basically saying we need to move towards your more conventional type of PLC firms up towards more democratic forms. So the more we have of democratic ownership forms, then the more likely we'll have a ability to retain more wealth and wealth be circulated more effectively. So ownership is kind of key, including democratic ownership. Another thing we need to think about, this guy here is a Harvard law professor, Brazilian politician, philosopher. Roberto Ungar says that this moment we're in, this inflection point, we need to experiment like mad. Because those little experiments, those little test beds of community land trusts, of public banking, of different forms of activism, they foreshadow the bigger change. They give us a glimpse into the bigger world we need to move into. So we need to experiment and amplify and scale those experiments up. So when people say, oh, that's just a small thing, yes, it's a small thing, but it gives us a glimpse, and we need to sing about it. We need to celebrate that success. We need to say this is brilliant, and that foreshadows the bigger change. We need to do more and more experiments to go faster and faster. Next one, Jack. In a sense, this is the toggle between the people power, the activism, the experimentation, and the inflection point of how that relates to formal power, politics, and institutions. We could do a lot of experimentation, but it always stays horizontal. We need to be conscious of how does it play into formal power, big politics, and the big institutions. And I think that is a problem for us, a challenge for us, but our great experimentation, our horizontal stuff needs to start moving more towards the vertical, horizontal to the vertical. And that, for us at TDC and for Community Wealth Building, is a very important consideration, that inflection point when it goes from the horizontal to the vertical. Next one, Jack. I'm conscious of time, but community wealth building, in a sense, is one of these experiments. It's about democratizing the economy, and its entry point chooses economic development as its entry point, and looks to transform our local economies based on communities having more of a direct ownership and control of their assets. It's an attack, folks. It's a direct attack on the failing approaches that have been accepted in American economic development by addressing wealth inequality at its core. So it has its own penchant, has its own entry point, and it's around economic development, and it's around this attack on wealth inequality. Next one, Jack. There's a copy of a guide that we have on community wealth building just for information. Next one, Jack. And I'll finish on this. I mentioned earlier the whole point about hydrology and water flows of wealth. What community wealth building seeks to do very intentionally, very deliberatively, is to replumb our economy. It takes the flow of wealth as it is at the moment and seeks to redirect it, rewire, replumb the American economy so that wealth as a flow flows to the people that need it, nurtures the planet, and is sustainable. Next one, Jack. There's 5 different pillars, pipes of wealth that we talk about. We look for fair work, decent terms and conditions, good wages, living wage, locally rooted finance, and we'll hear some of that coming up from Trinity, just use of land and property in terms of community land trusts, and we'll hear that from Lydia. Procurement, look at how we use public spend to support local democratic economic activity, local firms, and inclusive and democratic enterprises. This whole bit about democratizing the economy. So what Community Wealth Building does, it uses these 5 pillars as a way of replumbing our economies. And we have a range of different places across the USA and globally who are looking to put in actions around these 5 pillars of CWB. Next one, Jack. We see these 5 pillars as, like, we call it the wedge. They're intentionally working locally, working together locally in place, and then that hopefully build up those experiments, build up those individual activities that are part of those pillars, and seek to grow and grow them, and eventually take over more and more of the economy, if you like, the extractive economy. So we unashamedly can start small, but seek to grow and increase the extent to which community wealth building activity grows within places. Next one. Here's some examples of community wealth building activities across the USA and elsewhere. There's the top left there is Chicago. That's Seattle in the bottom left. A small town city of Meadville in Pennsylvania. Excellent stuff going on there. There's stuff going on in Sydney in Australia. And that middle one is a whole national program of community wealth building in Scotland, the country where I'm actually from. Next one, please. That's all for me. I hope that was helpful. And sadly, I have to leave at 1:15 the hour, but hopefully that's good so far. And I'll pass you back to Emily. Thanks very much, Emily.
Thank you, Neil. That was great. Gave us a wonderful overview of big system change to help the whole panel have some big picture kind of context. So especially if you have any questions or comments for Neil, please get them in and we'll front load them when we get to the discussion part. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Trinity.
Thanks, Neil. Thanks, Emily. Hi, everyone. I'm Trinity Tran with the California Public Banking Alliance and Public Bank Los Angeles. We are 2 all-volunteer advocacy groups working to establish city and regional socially and environmentally responsible public banks in California. So I just wanted to give a quick nod to Emily, Kawano, and David Cobb for coordinating this panel, because I think it's so critical to connect these 3 pillars, as Neil mentioned, to create a solidarity economy, tying in community wealth building model with community land trust that Lydia will discuss, which is community control over housing. And then, of course, with public banking, which is banks owned by local governments, accountable to communities that will leverage our public funds to finance solutions for people on planet. And it's all about local ownership and control of resources. And it all ties together very synergistically to create stronger and more resilient economic futures. So on the finance piece, on the finance pillar of this panel, I'll be discussing public banking. So I'll walk us through about 15 slides in this presentation to provide an overview of public banking, looking at some of the benefits and advantages, and a progress update on California's local and regional public banks. Jack, I think you need to forward because it's, yeah, there you go. So on the next slide, we can go to the first slide. the divestment slide. So this was our group in Divest LA during the divestment movement that swept across the nation in 2017. There I am on the right under that blue Divest LA sign. So we formed Public Bank LA during the Divest LA campaign when we realized that by the city of LA divesting from Wells Fargo, that Los Angeles would just essentially move its money to another big predatory big banks. And just to give some context to that, the public banking movement really emerged out of the divestment and investment framework. And that was really driven by the need for an alternative institution that better aligned with our environmental and social objectives. And for us as activists in the divestment movement that we're fighting in allyship with indigenous groups that were working to defund the big banks that were financing the Dakota Access Pipeline, that were destroying indigenous homelands and water supplies and communities, we wanted to take a more inward turn and a deeper look at where cities were housing our public funds. So the public banking movement really was an evolutionary step that grew out of the divestment work that we and so many activists around the country were working on. But again, we quickly realized that if cities were to divest from one big bank, those funds would then ultimately get rerouted to another large mega bank. So the only true form of divestment was to divest from Wall Street altogether. Because most of those banks, of course, were heavily invested in fossil fuels. They've been fined billions of dollars for exploiting customers. So we needed to fight for an alternative banking institution that would entirely serve the public interest and our communities. So that really required a shift towards a more community-centered approach through, of course, the creation of publicly owned financial institutions. Next slide, please, Jack. You can keep forwarding it. Thank you. What's a public bank? So a public bank is a financial institution. It's owned by that's owned by public entities. So it can be owned by either a state, a city, a region, or a JPA, Joint Powers Authority. So the deposits of a public bank are made from our public funds, and that's the taxes, the fees, the revenue that our city accrues, which the public bank then leverages to create loans, just like any other commercial bank. But unlike private commercial banks, the interest and profit of a public bank belongs to the community, and a public bank serves a mission that reflects really the values and needs of the community it represents. So they're formed with social benefit purposes. They're required to invest in and lend to the communities they serve, and local self-control is really central to public banking. That means deposits are made locally, investments are made locally, the decision-making process for investments are made locally. And that's really the primary benefit of public banks, is to enable cities to keep our money local. So you can imagine if our cities and our states could be self-sufficient and able to reinvest public funds back into our communities and redirect public dollars towards addressing local pressing needs like affordable housing, green energy, infrastructure, small business loans, and historically underserved areas. A public bank also makes the cost of debt cheaper for cities and states, and so it does this by buying and issuing debt below market because it has access to low-cost lending from the Federal Reserve. And with a city-owned bank, we can make loans and investments using public funds to benefit the public instead of private shareholders. So that means rather than billions of our tax dollars getting siphoned out of our cities by out-of-state Wall Street banks, public banks would allow our state, our localities to really recapture this interest that we pay to private bondholders and recirculate that money back into the local economy. And the public banking model that we're working on to create in California per Assembly Bill AB 857, the California Public Banking Act, that's the historic law that we passed in 2019. And I'll go over that in a few slides. But that bill creates public banks, a framework for public banks that will partner with local community banks and credit unions and CDFIs, community development financial institutions. So it would support local smaller banks and rather than competing with them. The public banks would provide liquidity and extend their credit line so that they can in turn offer low-cost retail and consumer benefits, and that will make it easier for smaller banks and credit unions to provide services to the general public. So we're advocating for a wholesale bank, which is essentially called a banker's bank. So they would become the main depository for cities and states. And we're not competing with customers with credit unions and community banks. So this would be a partnership relationship. And then the defining difference between a public bank and a private bank is that public banks make loan investments using public funds to benefit the public instead of private shareholders. Next slide, please, Jack. So this is a graphic that essentially, this graph is essentially public banking in a nutshell. And I think it illustrates the concept in a very simple and powerful way. Our public funds and where they are now and where they can be routed. So we can continue allowing our money to flow towards fossil fuels and weapons of war and industries that really inflict harm on our earth and our communities, or we can redirect that money towards building sustainable, regenerative sectors of society like green economy, affordable housing, support local businesses, and focusing on community-centered economic development. Next slide, please, Jack. And snapshot of LA's finances. You can keep forwarding, Jack. So we'll take a look at, in this slide, we'll look at the city of LA's finances as an example of where public funds currently flow, and then move into why public banking is a critical solution to reclaim these funds. So as an example, the city of LA has about $8 billion in revenue. And that's, again, money collected from taxes and fees and fines that the city generates. So LA borrows money from commercial banks to finance city needs, which is currently costing us about $100 million in fees, over $100 million in fees. Thanks. Over $100 million in fees and over 700 million debt service annually. So that is what it costs our city to borrow money from private commercial banks every year. We're paying close to $1 billion every year to private commercial banks. So every time the city or one of its agencies issues a bond, Wall Street then tacks on fees for structuring and selling those bonds. So for every bond measure the city issues, it has to pay fees to private banks. And these fees mean that taxpayers end up paying more for what the city originally borrowed. So the city currently invests our own treasuries that are from our checking and savings in ExxonMobil, Chevron, JP Morgan Chase. They together hold about $500 million of taxpayer funds. So this works directly against our city's climate priorities and the well-being of our residents. So this is the reality of how funds are diverted from cities towards private interests that drain wealth and resources from our communities and are destructive to our environment. So instead of investing over $500 million of public funds in private corporations with a public bank, we could leverage those funds to invest in some of the areas from the previous slide: affordable housing, green energy, small businesses, and especially in communities of color that are often neglected and sidelined by large mega banks. Next slide, please. Interest payments to Wall Street in perspective. So this is a graphic from Acres' 2020 Cancel Wall Street report, and it puts the city's payments to private banks in perspective. So instead of funneling over $1 billion paying interest to Wall Street, the city of LA could have redirected those funds towards essential areas like helping over 51,000 families avoid eviction. They could have provided unemployment assistance to over 200,000 folks and could have provided internet access to every single student in the Los Angeles Unified School District. Next slide, please. The benefits of a public bank. Number one is to save money and maximize dollars. There's a really common sense and logical reason why cities support public banks and why we're seeing so much movement in the public banking space just within the last few years. And that's to save money and allow us to do more with our tax dollars. So there's a fiscally responsible argument to supporting public banks. Cities and counties and states in the US right now hold over $700 billion of public money in private commercial banks. These banks, of course, charge our local governments huge fees to hold their deposits and perform cash management services. So this is money that's being extracted out of our communities to essentially line the pockets of private shareholders. Cut borrowing costs significantly, doubling our power to invest in local government. So nearly 50% of all cost of infrastructure project goes towards paying bank interest and fees. So that means if the city wants to build a project, they want to build a bridge or road, they often turn to the private market. So as a result, debt service and finance costs are some of the biggest drains on our public budget. So year after year, our cities are paying back billions of dollars in loans with interest, which leaves less money available to invest in critical areas and build housing and hospitals and schools. So if we were able to fund public projects ourselves through a public bank, we could significantly reduce the cost of infrastructure and essentially double our power to invest in our communities. Leverage is a hugely powerful tool of public banks, because a public bank can do what all banks can do, which is leverage its funds up to 10 times. So with the multiplier effect, that means $10 million in a public bank guarantees about $100 million of loans. $100 million guarantees about $1 billion in loans. But instead of leveraging to fund fossil fuels and private prisons and areas that generate short-term profits for private shareholders, the city-owned bank empowers our cities and our communities to really lend to areas that support the environment and the sustainability of our neighborhoods. So support local economic development through targeted investments. It will align city climate and social goals with investment and finance policies. Partnership lending is another benefit of public banks. And California public banks, as I mentioned, are required to do their lending through partnerships with local financial institutions, credit unions, and community banks. Public banks can extend their credit lines so that they can offer low interest loans and low cost consumer services. So it would increase the availability of credit in areas that Wall Street banks aren't currently serving, and especially in historically underserved communities of color. Next slide, please. Bank of North Dakota. So here in the US, public banks are relatively unknown. When we started the California campaign several years ago, it was a virtually unknown, very kind of esoteric idea. And within the last few years, we've been able to pass 2 state laws in California, and there's been incredible progress and momentum throughout California and the United States. It's still relatively unknown here, but across the world, 40% of banks are actually globally owned. The BND, the Bank of North Dakota, was established in 1919, and that was the first public bank in the United States, and it was actually created to protect North Dakota farmers from out-of-state bankers who are gouging these farmers with high interest rates and limited access to credit. So it was the first public bank was created by socialist farmers in a red state, which interestingly enough, 100 years later, nearly 100 years later, the public banking movement also emerged out of North Dakota with what was happening with Standing Rock. It was a kind of an evolution of the movement that happened out of Standing Rock. So life kind of beautifully came full circle there. So today, the Bank of North Dakota provides inspiration for a lot of the movements around the nation, because it's a successful model to emulate for a few reasons. It was able to withstand the economic crash of 2008 because it doesn't get involved in kind of the Wall Street risky casino gambling. The state-owned Bank of North Dakota has returned record profits with 15% ROI, 15% return on investment in 2022. Since 1945, it's returned over $1 billion back into the state's general fund. And during the pandemic, the Bank of North Dakota provide the largest per capita payout of PPP loans to small business of all the 50 states. So without any Wall Street middleman, without any leakages, the Bank of North Dakota was able to deploy capital quickly and efficiently to help small businesses get back on their feet. Public banks, just like the Bank of North Dakota, would have lower operating costs. So that's one of the biggest benefits of public banks, is that public bankers are public servants, which means no large bonuses, no fees, no commissions, no high paid CEOs. That means no $36 million compensation, which is what Jamie Dimon received last year. No private shareholders, no advertising. This is a low overhead, streamlined operation. Profit from a public bank returns directly back to the community. Next slide, please, Jack. Thanks. Green New Deal. So 60 of the world's largest commercial investment banks have financed $5.5 trillion of fossil fuel projects since the Paris Accord. With public banks, we could finance public projects like in decarbonization and energy retrofits and infrastructure costs less when it's publicly funded, which leaves more money for renewable energy projects and programs. And an international example of the power of public banks for the green energy space is the Sparkassen network. It's a network of about over 400 public banks in Germany. These are owned and controlled. Banks are owned and controlled by local governments in Germany, and it's these public banks have played a really significant role in Germany's transition to a low carbon economy. They've been able to provide financing for over 70% of the country's renewable energy projects. So you can think of the possibilities here in California and here in the nation if we were to establish public banks that could help accelerate the work that cities are doing towards in the green energy space. Next slide, please. Racial equity will be baked into public banks. So banks, as many know, have a long history of redlining and discriminating against communities of color for many decades. And existing incentives really are a Band-Aid solution. So instead of investing in education and healthcare and fixing our streets, or affordable housing, cities have to divert huge portions of their already limited budget to paying back loans with interest to commercial banks. So publicly owned institution whose sole mission is to serve the people and the public good can really help bridge the racial equity gap, and they can provide historically underserved communities with access to low-cost capital and credit, and it does this through participation lending, which keeps capital local and it targets projects that as I mentioned before, targets projects that big banks tend to not support, such as social good investments. Or with public banks, we can prioritize reinvestments on Main Street and in frontline communities. Next slide, please. Affordable housing and small business. So a public bank can help simplify the very complex web of affordable housing, which currently it takes about 12 dozen to 15 different funding sources to build affordable housing. So by centralizing and streamlining funding, a public bank could give affordable housing developers the cash flow that they need to be able to quickly and efficiently purchase and preserve existing housing and build new affordable housing. So public banks can keep interest payments within public funds. So it reduces the overall cost of financing for community housing and also transit projects. And this makes bond financing more accessible and affordable. Reduce loan costs for small businesses. Public banks can establish underwriting standards that would make it cheaper for small businesses to access loans. Next slide, please. AB 857, the California Public Banking Act. So my organization, as mentioned, is an all-volunteer grassroots network of public banking advocates representing 10 cities and regions, working with California governments from across the state to form city and regional public banks with a mission that these banks are going to be socially and environmentally responsible. And since 2019, we've led the passage of 2 public banking bills in California. The first was California Public Banking Act, which Governor Newsom signed at the end of 2019. And the second is the California Public Banking Option Act, which I'll briefly go over in a few slides. But the first bill that we passed, the California Public Banking Act, this was a historic bill because it was the first bill in the nation that paved the way, that created the legal framework for cities like Los Angeles and San Francisco and regions like the East Bay to start public banks. And this bill created that framework for these cities to apply to state regulators to charter public banks. Public banks are tax exempt. And under California law, they're required to obtain FDIC insurance, and they're governed by public entities and established to serve the public interest. And it's written in the California Public Banking Act that public banks, as defined by the California law, will be established for a few key reasons. One is for the purpose of cost savings. Two, to strengthen local economies. Three, to support community economic development. 4 and 5, addressing infrastructure and housing needs for localities. So public banks will directly serve the lending needs of our cities. And under the Public Banking Act, the sponsoring local government has to take a few steps to obtain a license from regulators. The first is to conduct a viability study, present it to the public, and receive approval from the governing body before submitting an application to state and federal regulators. And public banks created under AB 857 will be subject to the same financial and regulatory requirements as commercial banks, and will also need to comply with the Brown Act and Public Records Act, which will really help ensure that they're run transparently with good governance and commitment to the public interest. And the governance of each public bank will be informed by input during the creation of the business plan. So it's really up to each region's elected reps and banking experts and constituents to provide input on a governance structure that they feel is most democratic without political interference. And which, as required by law, the public banks will be required to do its lending in partnership with local financial institutions. Next slide, please. So status of California's public banking initiative. So following the passage of the Public Banking Act and the regulations being finalized in 2022, there's 5 local governments in California actually taking concrete steps to establish public banks. So I'll go through this quickly. Central Coast, there's a 4-county regional efforts with 10 jurisdictions working to fund a viability study. East Bay is the furthest ahead. They're creating a regional bank owned by Oakland, Berkeley, Richmond, and Alameda County. They're working to finalize their business plan to submit to regulators, hopefully by the end of this year. Los Angeles, second largest city in the nation, approved nearly $500,000 in funding for phase 1 of the LA Public Bank feasibility study and business plan. Sacramento, the state capital here in California, their city council released a request for quotation for consultants. So they will be working to develop the Sacramento Public Bank viability study within the next year. And then San Francisco has a lot of support from their elected officials and their board of supervisors. They've approved plans for a public bank as well as an interim green bank that will tap into the IRA Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund Act. And they're hoping to stand that green bank up within the next 6 months. So a lot of exciting movement across the nation. There's about 22 active public banking campaigns or legislations moving through states in the nation. Next slide, please. So just the last few slides, I'm just going to take a few minutes to pivot to our second public banking bill that we're simultaneously working to implement. So as we're working to bank cities, we're also simultaneously working to bank the general public. So CalAccount is also known as California Public Banking Option Act. That was the second bill that we passed at the end of 2021. So CalAccount is a state-run digital platform that will provide all Californians with easy access to a basic checking account with debit card service. Users can open an account. They can access an entire network of ATMs and retail locations without fees or penalties. They can access direct pay, automatic bill pay, receive public benefits. All accounts are federally insured, and there's no cost to account holders. This is a zero fee, zero cost, zero penalty bank account that all Californians would be able to opt into. And our goal really with CalAccount is to provide a solution for the 1 out of 5 Californians, which is nearly 8 million people who are unbanked or underbanked and don't have adequate access to a bank account, which primarily impacts people of color and low-income Californians. Next slide, please. Banking stats. So in 2022, banks collected almost $37 billion in bank account fees, 84% of which came from the poorest 9% of customers. So these are high fees that make it harder for folks who are already struggling this makes it, creates a very unfair situation for folks who are already struggling financially. Black and Latino households pay bigger shares. And as opposed to white households, Black households pay about 7% of their income to bank interest and fees, 5% with Latina households, and white households, in contrast, pay about 3%. And that really builds the case for why we need public financial infrastructure. We need a protected way for folks to be able to access their funds, particularly for communities of color. Next slide, please. And that should be the final slide. So the next steps for the CalAccount program, the CalAccount Public Banking Option Bill that we passed, it created the CalAccount Blue Ribbon Commission, which is chaired by the state treasurer, who is currently overseeing the market analysis report of the CalAccount program. And that report will determine the cost, the need, the feasibility of the program. And the consultants are expected to finalize their market analysis report this July. 2024. So we'll be coordinating public comment with community organizations and stakeholders for our second town hall, statewide town hall this July. And we'll also be preparing to introduce a CalAccount bill in 2025 in the 2025 legislative session for their approval of the report. So, and once CalAccount is approved by the California State Legislature, it will be the first state level public banking option platform in the US that would provide universal banking services to all residents. So we're working to transform banking into a public utility, which it should be free and accessible to everyone, which is going to be a game changer, especially for marginalized communities and communities who have been far too long exploited by the banking system. So that wraps up my portion. So I'll hand it back to you, Emily.
Thank you, Trinity. That was great, really thorough, so much information packed in there. And I do believe like the slide decks will be shared out. So that was a question in the chat. Looking at the time, I'm wondering if we can do the following because Neil has to leave early and there are some questions for Neil. Lydia, I am wondering if it's okay to give Neil maybe like 5 minutes just to address the questions that are directed at Neil and then come back to you.
Of course.
Is that okay? Great. Thank you for being flexible. Neil, I don't know if you were following the questions. Do you want to just go ahead and answer them without me reading them? You might want to contextualize what were the questions. So how about, can you do that in 5 minutes? You're muted.
Yeah, no, thanks, Emily. Thanks for being accommodating, everyone. Yeah, I put some written answers in the chat, but there was a question about what was Gramsci on about when you talked about the new, and I said it was quite complicated and obviously bound with the historical context of the time. But basically, is that the alternatives were being thwart or stymied by fascism. And the political issues and the activist fractures of that time. So there is kind of lessons there that the new can be born if we get our shit together, folks, yeah, and start coordinating and collaborating much greater. And we know we focus on the enemy, if you like, and we focus on who we need to attack. And I think that's kind of quite key in terms of lessons from Gramsci. I don't know if there are any other questions. Oh, yes, a question about abundance. What's a concept of abundance besides wealth? Global warming is also abundant. It's a question of how much wealth is enough, and it made me think of the notion of the economics of enough. We know that once you've got levels of material satisfaction, you have levels of luxury. No matter how much wealth you have, you're not going to get any happier, and you're not going to have any better mental well-being. There's a sort of, once you get a certain level of economic, well-being, no matter how much more wealth you've got, you're not going to get any. It's pointless. In fact, there's evidence says the more wealth you have, actually the more unhappy you become. So there is this sense of societies understanding when they get to an inflection point where they've got enough in the economy, that you flick and you start looking towards well-being and nurturing the planet rather than just generating more and more wealth. Now, that's a macro decision to be made by society, but it's certainly something that community wealth building plays into the economics of enough, ideas of steady state, the ideas of degrowth, the ideas of what is this economy for and who's it working for, and how does it create something which is abundant and enough for everyone. I think that it's kind of key. I don't know if there's any other kind of questions, unless you've spotted something, Emily, but I'll shut up and let Lydia come in.
Thanks, Neil. Really appreciate that. Okay, so our last presenter is Lydia.
Thank you, and I'm just gonna share my screen here. Thank you for having me. I'm Lydia Lopez with the California Community Land Trust Network, and happy to be part of this panel. It's really inspiring to hear the other panelists, and some of this is going to echo a lot of what they're saying. We need more investments in community. We need to see that our tax dollars are going where they should be going and not into the pockets of for-profit endeavors. And we just need to foster more collaborations among all of us, and also partnerships with government and with other stakeholders. So let me move my slide here. The community land trust movement in the United States goes back to the roots of the 1960s struggles of former slaves in Georgia. And this model of affordable housing is not something new. There's a lot of countries in Europe that have invested in these types of communities with a lot of investment in affordable housing that is not a commodity. It's just a community asset. It's a community resource. The community land trusts promote community building by decommodifying the land. And by doing that, they stabilize the communities and they prevent displacement. Our programs focus a lot on policy advocacy at the state level, and also we support local campaigns. We also put together tools and curriculum and technical guides for our members. And we started a new program, technical assistance, a year ago, and that has grown into 4 different areas. And we also have a community building program where we hold in-person events and Zoom events for our members and our allies. And I'm just gonna go over a few case studies as well. Some of you will already know about this, but the origins of the community land trust here go back to Lee County, Georgia. There was a group of enslaved farmers that organized the first CLT. They managed to purchase over 5,000 acres of land, and through institutional discrimination by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, they were unable to get loans to develop the land, and they lost it to a foreclosure in the 80s. And they were part of a large lawsuit in 1999, and 10 years later, they got the largest federal settlement for civil rights violations of the USDA against Black farmers, and they were able to get that $990 million in settlement. The community land trust relies on this legal structure where you separate the ownership of the land from the buildings. And so the homeowners are purchasing the buildings. The land trust is retaining ownership of the land, and can steward it in perpetuity for community purposes. And there's a relationship between the two through a 99-year ground lease that establishes each other's responsibilities. Now, the community remains involved in the decision-making because the homeowners are part of the board, and so they're part of the governance of the community land trust nonprofit. There's various models there's various models that have been used for community land trust. You know, you have your typical single-family home. Some residents organize as a limited equity housing co-op. Some have a condominium with a homeowners association. And some include rentals, like in the case of multifamily rental buildings. In some situations, if the homeowners are not yet if the residents are not yet homeowner ready, there's a plan that is typically 3 to 5 years for them to go from renters to homeowners. There's also some special situations where the residents don't want to become homeowners. They're happy being renters. And so the community land trust is a model that lends itself to, you know, all these situations. And it emphasizes the community ownership of the resources. The other uses go beyond housing. There's a lot of really exciting mixed uses in community land trusts. Some of them involve micro business, worker co-ops, urban agriculture, open spaces, and community spaces. And some of them also incorporate specific needs that the community has, and they can be voiced through their governance or through the outreach that happens with residents. Sometimes the land trusts incorporate, for example, nonprofit hub spaces in the bottom space, in the commercial space on the bottom floor. And so this is, again, the split ownership. So I'm gonna skip this slide. How the community land trust gets started in a million ways. There could be tenants organizing to purchase their own building with the help of a nonprofit that's aligned. There could be an existing community land trust incubating another land trust. There could be a city or regional government, you know, that's interested in stabilizing the housing for the workforce. And we have seen a lot of examples of that in California. And there's also nonprofit affordable housing developers. And so there's a lot of considerations for starting or growing a land trust. One of the main ones is staffing. As nonprofits, community land trusts struggle like a lot of nonprofits in the current economic climate. And so there's not always enough unrestricted funding for operations. And so besides the hurdle of you know, accessing capital for the acquisition and the rehab that needs to happen, that the other main hurdle we hear at the network level is the staffing. And so there's a lot of volunteers, and the board is typically a working board that does a lot of the work even before the organization hires actual staffing. A lot of times they also have a community organizer that helps to do outreach and that is coordinating with the community members, you know, about this model, educating about the model and about what options the community has with these kinds of projects. And there's typically partnerships with various stakeholders, including, you know, other nonprofits, lenders, many times with government who is providing funding or land or some other resource. And these are 3 examples from some of our network members that rely a lot on volunteers, like Liberty CLT. There's another CLT in Vallejo that is using organizers to do some of the work and organize the community. And there's Pahali that borrows staff capacity from another nonprofit. And so this is a roadmap for starting or growing a CLT. At the first stages, the community and their partners are looking at who they should, they should be partnering with as a matter of strategy, who can help this project come to fruition. And there's also identifying, a specific property or likely properties, and identifying the sources of funding. And a lot of times at the early stages, the community gets involved to help design the project and say what type of amenities they would like to be included in this project. And as far as the resources, the CLTs have to cobble together resources from a bunch of different places to make this project a reality. We're definitely looking forward to any news about public banking and how we can partner with public banks, as these efforts get underway and become more concrete. And definitely one of the big hurdles with lenders is that lenders don't always have products that are compatible with the community land trust model that splits the ownership of the land and the buildings. And so that's been a big challenge. One of the main partners with a lot of community land trusts in California has been philanthropy, some government through donations of land or grants, partnerships with aligned banks and nonprofit lenders. And then some of the CLTs also have program revenue and operating revenue from rental properties. And there have been CLTs also that have been successful with GoFundMe campaigns, for example, raising $1.5 million just among the community and allies who are supportive. There's also really neat collaborations, and I'm going to show one case study about life estate and planned giving, where a senior from Marine, collaborated with one of our network members in Marine, and they were able to sell the property, but remain in the property with the life estate after that. And so there's a lot of really great collaborations happening. And our membership currently is more than 40 established CLTs statewide. And among all of them, they serve 3,400 residents. There's also a large group of emerging CLTs that are in our membership. And we have several working groups and committees that do the work, organizing what needs to happen at the network level. We have a policy committee that meets twice a month, and our members highlight every year what's their priorities as far as policy that we will be advocating at the state level. We also have a curriculum committee that meets to figure out what tools we need to develop and what workshops to prioritize for our membership. And we also have very active Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act working group. We support several campaigns around the state. And we have a property tax and ADU working group. So we have several emerging, needs around taxation of community land trust, and some of our policy advocacy has to do with that. And we're also developing some tools regarding asset management as one of the areas that has been highlighted by our membership. And we also have a public lands working group that looks at how to access land dispositions. And so why we do this? We do this because, we're still dealing with all the ramifications of our past and enduring racism and inequality. And we have had a lot of the same problems around the states and worldwide, a lot of them stemming from colonialism. And, a lot of them have a lot of lead to chronic displacement of communities of color in a lot of places, including California. We have, the legacy of redlining. We have the legacy of abuses committed to people of color and to Native Americans. And so a lot of the work we do with Community Land Trust is trying to prevent displacement and to give some agency back to the people that are not able to always participate in decision-making process. And so this is some of our programs and what we do. Besides lobbying, we also have some budget advocacy. And right now we're trying to prevent that one of our bills that was passed 3 years ago gets defunded. And in the current climate, with budget deficits, it's been a struggle. We started out with 5 million that was supposed to use to prevent foreclosures and to designate, some of those buildings that were at risk of foreclosure to become a community land trust. That fund has been slashed roughly to half right now. And so we have, an active campaign before this gets decided at the state level. And if you want to support, please reach out to me. We also educate public officials, lenders, and philanthropy about the work that we do. And, there's a lot of interest in community land trust, but there's still a lot of misunderstanding about what it is and how it could help communities. And so there's always a lot of outreach that is needed. And there's been a lot of interest lately from city governments and county governments that are starting to notice that, this is one viable way to invest in communities and to invest in a way that you can have permanent affordability and not an affordability that will expire in a number of years, which is what has happened with a lot of the other styles of developing affordable housing. We also support advocacy coalitions and local, our local members whenever they're having local campaigns. And our current policy priorities have a lot to do with, creating alternatives to corporate ownership of housing. And so I was really happy when David invited me to this panel. I think, this is a very important topic as far as like looking really strategically at how we can all work together to decolonize our economy. And, some of the bills that we are working on are trying to expand, the definition of what is a community land trust. For example, to have, all the mixed uses that community land trusts typically include, that are uses the community wants and needs, have those uses also be able to get welfare exemption. Currently, only the proportion of the housing will get a welfare exemption. And so the other mixed uses, the remaining part of the land still will get a property tax. And so we're also looking at promoting more LLC transparency, because a lot of renters don't know who are their landlords. There's all these like, LLC formations, and it's really difficult sometimes for renters to assert their rights, even when cities are, having policies to protect renters. It's really difficult to do that if you don't know who is the landlord. And we're also supporting a bill on mobile home opportunity to purchase, because similar to how investors are scooping up properties left and right to turn them into for-profit tools, they're also targeting mobile home parks now. And they are, raising the fees, removing all the amenities that used to be included in the mobile home parks, charging all of those piecemeal, and really, squeezing all these vulnerable populations that are living in mobile homes in the first place because they got displaced from other places that were too expensive. We're also working on another bucket of policy priorities to fund permanently affordable housing and to preserve the housing that would be lost through foreclosures. That's the FIP fund that I was talking about earlier, the 500 million. And we're also supporting AB 1657, which is a housing bond that would also create additional tranches of funding to support community ownership specifically. And finally, we're working on a couple of tax bills to streamline the processing of the welfare exemption. And I'm gonna, go really quickly through a couple slides because I want to show you the case studies I talked about earlier, but we do have other programs and you can read about that in our website. We have capacity building, technical assistance, and community building, which is our conference and other events. We have several case studies I wanted to show you really quickly because I know that we want to have some time for questions at the end. But we have collaborations where government has repatriated land. We have cities that have supported with land and with grants. We have plan giving examples and partnerships with churches. And we have a couple other examples of municipal governments that are strong supporters of community land trust. Some of my favorite examples have to do with indigenous people because I am of Mayan descent. And so I am really happy to see when there's, a land back movement and when there's partnerships and when this is becoming a reality. The Chicago Humboldt CLT has been our partners for a couple of years, and we have been following their news. This is a Wiyot tribe that, was able to advocate, organize, and eventually get back an entire island for their programs. And so we're very happy, to support them. And also we have other partnerships, through our members. San Francisco CLT has been very successful rehabbing buildings in the city of San Francisco. They also work with the city to integrate with the city's portal for applications for housing. And they also have been very active with partnerships with community organizers, with lenders, with CDFIs and philanthropy. In Marine, we have a couple examples of collaborations. The Coast Guard Station was a collaboration with the federal government, and it involved a lot of logistics, securing that. It was formerly owned by Homeland Security. It's 32 acres with 36 stone homes that will be rehabbed. And it really involved a lot of collaborations and partnerships with, congressmen, senators, county supervisors, and other city officials and county officials for that project to become a reality. And our network member in Marine also has a collaboration with Bobby Leib, who was living in this home. She couldn't afford to repair her roof or pay her back taxes, and so she sold the home at half price to the Community Land Trust, and she retained a life estate, and the Land Trust repaired her roof, paid the back taxes, and so, this is a really nice collaboration with a senior citizen. And we also have some collaborations from our members with churches. This is a construction that was completed a couple years ago with 8 units, and it includes co-op housing on the CLT. And the residents had no prior relationship with each other. So, this is taking a vacant building through the process of co-op education and formation. And our partner, Bay Area CLT, is currently working on a couple other projects. In Irvine, this is a project that was incubated by the city itself to promote workforce housing. They include, housing for veterans, special needs residents, essential workers, low and moderate income. And they also include the option to rent or to own through the CLT model. And this is my last slide. Our partners in the city of Long Beach, they are a group of tenant organizers that work directly with the city. You know, they were very active, you know, showing up at city council meetings and making partnerships and nurturing those relationships. And they are working with a grant from the city, and they're on a timeline for 3 years, 3-year timeline to start acquiring a property and you know, start working on that program. And so you know, I'm gonna stop here because I know that we're short on time for questions. So thank you all for having me.
Thank you, Lydia. That was great. And I know people want the slides, including myself, but lots of information there. I mean, it's been just so rich. We do have just we have 8 minutes left. And so I'm going to give you each 4 minutes. So starting with Trinity and Lydia, check out the link where there are questions for you. So I'm going to be strict about this. 4 minutes for you, Trinity, and then 4 for Lydia.
Okay, great. I just did a quick glance of the document, and I'll answer the credit union, the difference between credit union and community banks, because that's a question that gets raised often. So credit unions are owned by customer members, so they're accountable to private depositors and not the general public. Whereas public banks are owned by local governments, owned by your cities and your counties, so they're accountable to elected representatives and communities they serve. So the mission and mandates of public banks will be designed by local constituents and accountable, and public banks are accountable to that constituency. And credit unions also typically serve they're typically smaller, with about less than $1 billion in asset size. Public banks would be able to also handle larger infrastructure, economic development projects, but they do work together in the same financial ecosystems where public banks would support community banks, credit unions by making joint participation loans. That means just infusing capital so that they can be able to provide low cost consumer services to the public. When you look at North Dakota, the only public bank in the United States, they have more credit unions and community banks per capita than any other state. So credit unions, we are a great alternative to Wall Street banks. We and the public banking movement are very supportive of them, and we encourage folks to bank with them. And it's the partnership relationship between public banks and community banks is something we're looking to help educate and socialize. Later this year, we're planning to do a symposium with local community banks and credit unions to kind of educate folks more on what that partnership relationship would look like. In California, in the 80s, there were about 14,000 community banks. There are now less than 5,000 banks. So when you kill off the community banks, this is something that Ellen Brown actually referenced once, is when you kill off the community banks, you kill off the small businesses that could depend on those community banks, and you kill off the local economy that then depend on that small businesses. So it's really important to build a strong, robust financial ecosystem where a public bank could help support those smaller public banks so that the general public can see the benefits of that as with small businesses and such.
In just maybe 1 minute, there were a couple questions about like some skepticism about the ability of the ability of
governance.
Yeah,
I did see that. So governance gets brought up quite often, and it's a legitimate question. I mean, here in Los Angeles, you know, we have a very complicated political system here in Los Angeles. Many of our elected officials have been indicted by the FBI. So there's a real concern about how the governance and oversight of these banks. So public banks will not be run by politicians. We want to make that very clear. They're going to be run by bankers, and these banks will be run by independent boards of governors. And those boards of governors ideally will be made of community residents in affordable housing and green energy, representing folks in marginalized communities that will work together with experts in public finance and banking and affordable housing and green energy. So by law, the public bank governance structure has to be approved by state and federal regulators, and they will not approve any structure that has political interference. So Okay, I just, if I could just
Okay.
say really quickly that there's 4 levels of
quick.
oversight, and one of them is going to be the community. So just like any other initiative, I think it's going to be really important for the public to be engaged, and provide the oversight needed to ensure that the mission and mandates of these banks will continue to serve the interests of the communities.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And I'm going to turn it over to Lydia.
Thank you, Emily. So someone asked to explain the difference between community land trust and a community land cooperative. And so I can say for sure for the community land trust, you have that split of the land and the buildings. And so the community land trust nonprofit is holding ownership of the land for affordable purposes in perpetuity. That's the key difference. With any other cooperative, depending on what they included in their bylaws, they may have other purposes that don't include permanent affordability and permanent stewardship of the land. It really varies depending on what that specific co-op has in their, in their bylaws. And otherwise, I definitely agree. Someone commented about we need more public banks to help finance, but I would nuance that by saying that, the lending products have to be compatible with what are the community projects happening on the ground. And for CLTs, one of the biggest challenges with lenders has been that their products are just not compatible with what we're doing. They don't like this split of the land and the buildings, and that's the primary way that the community land trust stewards the land for community purposes in perpetuity. Otherwise, when the land goes up in value, like what happens, all over California, when the land goes up in value, it just gets sold to the highest bidder. And so that split in the ownership of the land and the building is really key for us. And someone also said there's an increasing funding potential for CLTs through housing preservation trust in the more expensive land markets. Yes, that's true. One example I can point out is the Bay Area Housing Finance Authority. They have a business plan, and it's a regional bond measure that's going to generate 10 to 20 billion to build more affordable homes and to keep existing homes affordable. And we have been part of the discussions with them, similar to how we collaborated with the government when they were putting together the FIP program. And so, it's really been great to partner at that level, because we can help shape those programs. But then when the budget cuts come, some of those programs are the first to get cut. So I see that we're almost at time. So I'm gonna stop and hand it over to Emily, but thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Lydia. That was great. And I just want to say, yes, we have a minute left. Just want to give a huge thank you to all of our speakers, and including Neil, wherever he's off to. And thank you also to everybody who showed up and contributed your wisdom and your questions, and just invested the time to come and learn together. It's been just a fantastic panel. I've learned a lot. I definitely want all those slides. And yeah, thank you, everybody. And with that, we are at time. So enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks all. Have a good one.
Bye.